What's it like being an outsider in that most insidery world, Silicon Valley? Anna Wiener will join us to talk about her memoir, Uncanny Valley. What's the most important decision a book club makes? It's not where to host the next meeting. Actually, it is what to read. And so Elisabeth Egan, an editor at the Book Review, will join us to talk about her new monthly column, Group Text, in which she helps readers make those decisions and have conversations around worthy new books. She'll talk about her first month pick, Long Bright River by Liz Moore. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. I want to take a moment to tell you about a new series of events we've created called Book Review Live. At each event, we'll use books as a jumping-off point into larger discussions that help us better understand our world, kind of like we do here on the podcast. The first one is happening the evening of January 14th at the Times Center in New York City. We'll be welcoming Cheryl Boudin and my colleague Nick Kristof to talk about their new book, Tightrope: Americans Reaching for Hope. They'll be in conversation with our critic, Jennifer Salai. The book is a story about the disintegration of America's working class, as seen through the eyes of Nick and Cheryl's friends and neighbors. To dig deeper into the themes of Tightrope, we'll also hear from my colleague Andrew Ross Sorkin, watch clips from a new documentary based on the book, and enjoy readings from a surprise guest. You can buy tickets at nytimes.com/bookreviewlive. Hope to see you there. Anna Wiener joins us now from San Francisco. Her new book is called Uncanny Valley. It is a really incisive literary memoir by a young woman who goes from the world of entry-level literary agency assistant work in New York to the much better paying but very different workplaces of Silicon Valley. Anna, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Pamela.
So let's travel back in time to an unnamed moment you begin your book with, but you do situate it in other ways, to the time when you left your job as an assistant in a literary agency in New York and went to Silicon Valley. What year was that exactly?
I left the agency at the end of 2012 and started my first tech job on the first workday of 2013. So I didn't move out to Silicon Valley until April 2013.
Got it. And place that, if you would, in sort of the general timeline of internet and Silicon Valley business life, because this isn't the dawn of the internet, obviously. It's not even really Internet 2.0, but it's perhaps the dawn or the real explosion of social media. Is that how you would characterize it?
I think that by the time I moved out to San Francisco, it felt like the party was in full swing. It didn't feel like I was an early participant or that I was, at the fore of anything. I felt very much that I was sort of part of this wave of people who were looking for fulfillment or momentum in work. And that was a large part of what brought people out here. It wasn't the promise of innovation or this idea of a future that didn't yet exist. I think I sort of arrived at the moment when the future was fully fledged. But at the same time, it felt kind of like startup Disneyland to be out in San Francisco in 2013. I think I wrote in the book that the first place that I stayed temporarily was an Airbnb owned by one of the founders of Airbnb. And you had all of these Lyft cars cruising around with the gigantic mustaches on the front. So in terms of the landscape, it felt very much of a moment. But I think what you're asking is more about what was happening in the industry more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
So the company that I worked for did data analytics for digital products, so websites or apps. It was mostly for user-facing products. And the analytics platform helped other companies understand what their users were doing inside of their apps. So if you, for example, were on the product team for a food delivery app, you could track every action that people were taking inside of the app. So what people were putting in their basket, what they were taking out, what restaurants, at what times, in what cities, among what demographics. So any information that went into an app that was given by the user could be collected by this software. So you could do sort of retargeted advertising or outreach, or just tweak the product to better direct people through the user flow so that they could, optimize it for monetization, basically.
You've written this beautiful literary memoir. You were working at a literary agency before you went to Silicon Valley or to San Francisco. Why would you stop working at a literary agency and go to do what you just described?
For me, it was about trying to find a foothold in the future. I really just wanted a sense of momentum in work. I wanted to feel valued. I think at 25, I conflated value with meaning. And I guess what I mean by that is I felt that if I was making more money and in an industry that had a lot of excitement around it and these really compelling narratives that the industry was telling about itself, I felt that that was how to have value in society. I think in hindsight, that conflation of moral superiority with your economic output is really dangerous and part of why we found ourselves in the situation we're in now. But yeah, at the time, I just was looking for stability and momentum and a feeling that I was contributing something. And in publishing in 2013, I loved the people I worked with and I loved working on books, but I just couldn't see a future for myself that seemed sustainable.
Well, let's talk about some of the numbers just to give people a sense. You are millennial. I'm not. I'm Gen X. When I graduated from college, the starting salary in publishing was a range between $14,500 and $18,000 if you were very lucky. You were not making a lot more than that, right? Working at a literary agency.
No, I was making actually probably a pretty good salary for an assistant job. I was making $29,000 to $30,000 a year. I was still on my parents' health insurance. And it's funny because I had friends at very prestigious publishing houses who were assistants with more influence than I had who were making $27,000 a year.
I mean, that is terrifying to try to get by in New York City on that amount of money.
It's not great. And I don't want to overstate my hardship. I did not have student debt. I had a safety net, in terms of my family was very supportive. I'm from New York. It's not like I was going to be tossed out on the street at any point. But I do think that those salaries do make the industry pretty exclusive, right? If you have student debt, you're not going to take a $30,000 a year job in New York City. And so some of the problems of publishing, I think, in terms of diversity or insularity do kind of start at that entry level.
And what was the difference when you went out to San Francisco?
Oh, they were like, would you like to dive into our pool of money? Like in San Francisco, the starting salary for a customer support role at the company that I went to work for was $65,000 a year with health insurance and dental insurance and paid vacation. And it felt so decadent to me. And it felt like I could only go up. For me, someone who, like you said, I'm a millennial. I graduated college in 2009. I have a sociology degree. It was a terrible job market in 2009. And to suddenly be in this place where there was just nothing but money and nothing but opportunity was completely intoxicating. And I felt really safe in that career path.
Given the fact that this was a predominantly male company, I mean, that is one of the big differences between the work life out in Silicon Valley and the work life you had in New York City, where publishing is still is pretty female dominated. How did that change your workday, your sort of daily life in the office?
I really did try not to think about it too much, but it obviously colored everything. I think that especially being a woman in what is considered a non-technical role, you sort of have to prove yourself over and over again. But I don't know. I don't know that I handled it super well. I think that I sort of vacillated between trying to mute or erase myself or just kind of be a pleaser and then sort of trying to advocate and trying to make the workplace feel more comfortable. It was something I really struggled with, and I don't know that I have a great answer for it.
I mean, the book is very observational in terms of what your own experience was like in Silicon Valley and sort of what it says about the culture out there. Were you thinking all along, I'm going to write about this? Were you writing as you were going to work? Were you going home and taking notes at night?
No, that was never the goal. When I was researching for the book, I have a lot of emails that I wrote to friends that were just about how I was feeling and what was going on. And work was my whole life, so I was talking about how I was feeling at work. So that was really useful because it was a little hard in 2017 and 2018 to sort of summon that 25-year-old idealism and excitement. But I've always written. I have written, personal essays, and I wrote fiction for a really long time just in private. And one of the things I do as like a note-taking practice is if I'm like on the subway or in a restaurant and I hear a snippet of dialogue or see something interesting, I will email it to myself. So I have thousands of emails to myself that are just little observations, or maybe they're just the subject line, 3 words, and I'll remember what that reference is. But there are some things that I took down that were just the way people use language, the way that people would like zip around the office on these little go-karts that we had. But it was never my intention to write about this. I sort of fell into writing about it and realized that not only was I really enjoying writing about my life out here, but that it's actually an incredibly rich literary subject. And I had for so long kind of separated my day job from my writing that was a very pleasant surprise for me.
How different was it out there? What were you trying to get at in the book?
It's such a different world from New York City publishing. It is and it isn't, actually. I mean, I think that there are a lot of aesthetic differences, but in many ways, these are both business environments, and so they have the habits and characteristics of businesses in many respects. But in publishing, it felt like there were a lot of rules, and those rules had been in place for a very long time. They predated anyone that I was working for, and we were all beholden to a much older system. And in tech, it felt like there was a lot of excitement about breaking all of those rules and being a little irreverent and being different. One of the superficial ways I like to describe the difference between these two worlds is the way that people write emails. And this emphasis out here on speed and on rapid growth and on getting things out the door as quickly as possible, and you can fix it later if it's not quite working. In publishing, the final product is the final product. And so people are moving slowly. You want to take great care. You want to have it read 15 times by a human before something is published. You can see the values of the respective industries reflected in their respective products. But for me, as an impatient 25-year-old who felt like they had been stuck at work, this sense of speed was really seductive. And with a little bit more experience with this, I started to think that actually it's one of the root problems of the industry is the arrogance to think that it's like first thought, best thought in a way.
But initially you bought into it, or you felt yourself drawn in.
Oh, yeah. It's a very seductive culture. There's a lot about it that's very appealing. I don't think that the book is a polemic, and I don't feel that I need to apologize for the industry. Working in publishing, it felt like the sky was always about to fall. The industry was shrinking. There was very little upward opportunity. In Silicon Valley, there is that sense of optimism, and it's pervasive. And I think it's often at some cost. I think that a little more self-awareness or self-scrutiny on that front would be really useful.
You said earlier that it's not a polemic. It's not, a takedown of Silicon Valley. And yet you are applying a kind of critical lens to much of what goes on there. Does it seem to you like we're going through a moment of kind of reckoning or recalibration with regard to our relationship to technology and the companies that are profiting off that relationship?
I hope so. The book is a critique. I don't want to understate that or walk back from that. My hope is that it was a critique through the eyes of someone who was just a ordinary employee who drank the Kool-Aid or really bought into these narratives that the industry, that a lot of these companies tell about themselves and continue to tell about themselves. And I think a lot of people inside of them still really believe.
Presumably you had to sign NDAs at the companies you worked for, and that this had to have posed some challenges for you as a writer. I think you do some interesting stylistic things where you don't name companies but describe them in such terms that the reader will immediately know who and what you're talking about. But how did you choose to handle the NDAs that you had signed for the companies you had worked with when you're trying to write about those experiences?
The naming scheme that I landed on for the book, in which I don't name corporations or executives, is not related to any paperwork I've signed. It's quite easy to figure out where I worked and the people at these companies that I'm writing about. My hope was that by not naming companies or executives, it would point out some of the structural dimensions of the industry. And in many ways, I think the companies that I worked for could have been any number of companies. So My hope is that the personal narrative illuminates these structural questions, but in navigating the paperwork that I've signed, and obviously there's a range in terms of the severity and limitations, but it was actually more of a challenge to navigate other people's NDAs because I did interview former colleagues and other people in the industry for my book just to get a gut check for my own experiences, to say, listen, we were in the same room, like, did this happen the way that I remembered it? And other people have had to sign non-disparagement agreements that are much more limiting than anything I ever had to sign. And so maneuvering around that was actually quite tricky because even a conversation with a colleague is something that some people, especially women, can't do. And so I think part of it is that I've left these companies on my own terms and did never have to exchange, severance pay for silence.
Would you ever work for a tech company again?
I really love what I'm doing right now, so it's hard to picture making that shift again. I'm writing about Silicon Valley, and I think that the things that were exciting to me as an employee 7 years ago are still exciting to me, but as a writer, I think I've sort of found the heart of it for me, and this world is really rich in a way that I've finally found a comfortable position in it. But possibly. I mean, I think that the same incentives I had to join the industry could come up again. I don't want to write it off, but it's very hard for me right now to think about what tech companies I would work for, in part because of this orientation towards scale and speed and rapid growth. I think I would probably just prefer to work for like a normal business.
Or a very slow one, like the publishing industry.
Sure. Or one that's not bound to venture capital.
All right. Anna, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I really, really appreciate it.
Anna Wiener is the author of Uncanny Valley. It's a memoir reviewed this week on the cover of the book review. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
Tell us what's new.
So my news is a little bit old. It's about the print bestsellers of 2019, which was just revealed by Publishers Weekly. They look at numbers provided by NPD Bookscan, and it's kind of interesting to look at the year in total and see what really popped and what sold and broke out versus things that didn't. The bestseller of 2019, it's no surprise, it's Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, which is a debut novel that we wrote about. We covered the rise of that book and sort of its surprising staying power. What's surprising is that book came out in 2018, and what's even more surprising when I look at the numbers is just by how much it outsold everything else. It's
even
kind of
Michelle
shocking.
Obama?
Well above Michelle Obama. So in 2019, and these are just print sales, Where the Crawdads Sing sold more than 1.8 million units, according to NPD. Michelle Obama sold 1.1. Both of those books came out in 2018 and are still the top sellers of 2019.
And neither is in paperback yet.
Neither is in paperback yet. And, when you account for audiobooks and ebooks and you put it all together, according to Delia Owens' publisher, Putnam, the book has sold well over 4 million copies. So it's
like the 1980s.
I know. These are like John Grisham from the 1980s numbers, but it's really quite remarkable. And, when I had first asked NPD for their tallies, it was before the end of the year, and she was already far and away the bestseller. But it's interesting to see that she also outsold Jeff Kinney and Dave Pilkey. So this includes nonfiction, young adult, children's, all these top sellers.
I got to know what number 3 is.
Number 3 is actually Dogman, Dave Pilkey. Yeah, more than 1 million copies, which, given how quickly my children devour those books, is no surprise. But what was interesting last year, and I think is still a source of concern for publishers and authors, is just what a hard time people had with fiction sales. Even, excellent books that got terrific reviews. It was just a hard year. I mean, there was so much news, and that's a big question mark, I think, going into 2020 also. I mean, the fiction lineup for 2020, my head is spinning. There's so much stuff that I want to read. There's Hilary Mantel, Luis Erdick, Julia Alvarez, just top-notch literary fiction writers are coming out with things, as well as commercial authors. Suzanne Collins has a prequel to The Hunger Games. But the question is everyone going to be so glued to the election and this endless news cycle that they're not going to have time for fiction? And it's a big question mark. I mean, there's a possibility that people will be burned out and will really want to escape into, the life of Thomas Cromwell, which Hilary Mantel is writing about, which I certainly want to escape into, although it does get a little brutal at the end.
We know what happened there.
So, yeah, no spoilers. This happened a while ago. So it'll be very interesting to watch how publishers position books and what sells this year.
Going back to 2019 for a minute, I still can't believe we're in 2020. There were so many books about politics. How did they do in terms of sales? Was there anything that really broke into the top 10 among the political books that came out?
That's such an interesting point because in 2018, you really saw the Trump bump. There were books like Bob Woodward's Fear, and before that you had Fire and Fury, and publishers were just racing to sign up anybody who left the Trump administration, which was a lot of people. And since then, there have been a number of additional books that fit that mold, tell-alls by former administration officials or in-depth kind of examinations by investigative journalists, and nothing has really broken out the way that those early books did. I think there might be a little bit of exhaustion on the subject matter. And if you look at the print bestsellers that NPD pulled together, the only political book on the list is Becoming by Michelle Obama. There are other nonfiction books that are appealing to people, particularly Educated by Tara Westover, which is still selling incredibly well. And I think, that hits on some of the issues that people are concerned with, in the moment. But these aren't news cycle-driven political books, and those books didn't actually sell as well as people expected.
Well, we'll see what happens in 2020. I think the big mystery is going to be fall.
Yes, exactly. Will anyone dare publish a book in the fall?
Other than Thin Thighs in 30 days.
Exactly.
All right, we'll see. Alexandra, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Elisabeth Egan joins us now to talk about the launch of a brand new column called Group Text. Liz, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about this new column. It's January. This is the first month that we are running it. It is not quite a book club. It is more like a book group. What's the difference?
I think the book club concept is ripe for reinvention. Unfortunately, I think that book club has become something that people dread. It's homework to be completed. It's a meeting at your house that you have to clear off your table for. You have to buy the baby carrots and the baba ganoush and the certain things that people always seem to have at book clubs.
Do your book clubs get competitive about cooking?
My book club has a loose rule that you're supposed to cook each month when you're hosting. If you're hosting, you cook a dinner that sort of goes along with the theme of the book. The minute I joined the book club, I started ordering takeout. So I brought the cuisine level down several notches. How about yours?
My book club has some very, very good chefs. But like yours, there is someone who does takeout in order to make the rest of us feel okay.
Do you like her?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes. It's a happy book club.
Yes, mine is too. Mine is very functional, and mine has made me reimagine how most book clubs should work, I think. So the concept of group text is that we will share a different book every month. It will be at the intersection of literary and commercial. The first pick, which I know we'll talk about in a minute, but I would describe it as a literary suspense novel. But the idea is that you read the book and perhaps communicate with fellow members of your book group throughout the month. It could be by text, it could be by email, it could be you run into them somewhere and you just have a casual conversation. And when you meet to talk about the book, you might not talk about it for the entire time. That's generally how my book club goes. We talk about the things that are happening in our lives and the things that we care about and things we're worried about. And usually the last 20 minutes of the meeting are when somebody says, wait, what book did we read this month? And we talk about it, but it feels more organic. The theme is woven into the conversation throughout the night. And that's what I'm hoping to get at with group text, is that kind of energy where you feel a sense of community and not a sense of guilt.
It also feels like the idea of a book group and a group text is that it can be a little bit more ad hoc. It can be in a way like what we have here in the office, where when we discover that there are other people who've read the same book that we have, we can kind of get together and talk about it, whether it's through, Slack or in person. And it doesn't have to be like, okay, this month we are all sitting down and we're going to cook the meal and have the conversation that generally doesn't happen, as you say, until the last 20 minutes. But you can actually just kind of get right into it, but on a more informal basis.
Absolutely. The vibe of our office is actually exactly what I would hope for in a book group. People come in the morning and they've read something the night before and they're dying to talk about it, and people join as they feel like it. I mean, I know not everybody can have a workplace like that. We're very lucky, but people join in the conversation, they drop out of the conversation. Maybe they have no interest in that book, so they don't participate at all. But it feels like something you join because you want to. It doesn't feel like an item to check off on your to-do list.
Right. And you can kind of go in and go out of it. You don't have to necessarily read the pick each month. I like that idea because I was thinking I was just on vacation. I read a number of books, and the one that I read last, which, spoiler alert, I'm not going to talk about what we're reading today, but it was Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing, which coincidentally was also on Barack Obama's list of his favorite books of 2019. And therefore, a lot of people have started reading it, and it's landed on our bestseller list this week. And I was thinking after I read it, like, I need to find the people in the office who've also read this so that we can just talk about it for a few minutes. Group text, in a way, seems to capture that idea.
Yes. And also one of my goals with group text is to spotlight a book that isn't necessarily the one book that everybody is talking about in a particular week or month or season. I feel like before I receive the email telling me what my book group is reading that month, I can often predict what it will be. There was a moment where All the Light We Cannot See was the one book everybody was talking about.
That moment lasted for like 2 years.
It did last. It lasted a long time. And there was the Gone Girl era. There was the Girl on the Train era.
The pachinko period.
Absolutely. I can go through all the phases of my life and tell you what the number one book is. I'm not in any way saying that Long Bright River is not the number one book, because in my mind right now it is. But I want to make sure that we're having a conversation about more than one book.
Mm-hmm.
In the column, we'll write about one book, to be clear. But I'm looking for books that are not necessarily the one that is the all the light we cannot see, if that makes sense.
Yes. Well, let's talk about this first book then, Long Bright River. It's a novel by Liz Moore. It is just out this week from Riverhead. And it has, perhaps tellingly, a quote from Paula Hawkins, the author of The Girl on the Train, on the cover. She calls it outstanding. So before we even get into the book, let's start with the author. Who is Liz Moore? Is this her first book?
Liz Moore is the author of two other books. The first is Heft, and the second is The Unseen World. She's a writer who's been bubbling up on the edge of my reading consciousness, and I always admire her books. And this one landed on my desk, and I just knew before I even read the first page that it was a plot that is right up my alley. It's about two sisters living in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia, which has been very hard hit in real life by the opioid crisis. And in the book, one of the sisters, Mickey, is a cop, and her younger sister, Casey, is an addict, and she is missing. And the book opens with Mickey being called to some train tracks where the body of a woman has been discovered, and she is concerned that it's her sister. She's convinced that it must be. I won't give anything away, but there's a serial killer prowling the streets of Kensington. And so the book is part mystery, who is killing all of these women, and part family story. We learn through a series of flashbacks about Mickey and Casey's childhood. It turns out their mother was also an addict. They were raised by their grandmother, who I think is one of the most fascinating characters in the book. And we also learn about Mickey's journey as a single mom, which is, I thought it was pretty moving. And it's also has a police procedural vibe. It feels like the best episode of Law and Order you've ever seen.
So it sounds like in terms of things to discuss, there's obviously the opioid crisis is a kind of big, meaty, troublesome, complicated issue, but that also then there are these family dynamics and kind of what is it that makes one sister go in the direction of law enforcement and another go down the path of addiction, and sort of how does that happen in a family?
Absolutely. And it puts a face on the opioid crisis in a way that I think a lot of the nonfiction we've been reading, like Beth Macy's Dope Sick, well, that definitely puts a face on the crisis. But I hadn't read about it so much in fiction before. And every day I commute through Penn Station and I walk by dozens of people who appear to be opioid addicts or addicts of some sort. I can't say for sure. But after reading this book, I am looking at them in a way where I'm thinking about they're somebody's daughter, somebody's son, somebody's parent. And of course, I knew that already. But this book has made me think about the people that I walk by on the streets of New York and consider who's looking for them.
So with Group Text, you have written a kind of review of the book, but also offered some questions for discussion. I think of that as such a tricky thing because it's kind of like introductions to classic novels when you're reading, a nice Penguin classic, and you worry about, well, do I want to read this introduction or is it going to give too much away? Is it hard to formulate discussion questions? Usually in a book, when it's become a book club selection in the paperback, they'll include those questions for discussion at the end so that they don't reveal too much. But here you're writing it on the page where someone's going to see it before they read the review. Did you think about, well, how do I construct these questions in such a way that I'm opening up these ideas without revealing too much about the novel?
Absolutely. And my main goal was also to construct those questions in such a way that they wouldn't leach the fun and the excitement and the suspense out of the book. I think if somebody were to show up at my book group with a list of discussion questions, it would feel like a little bit of a downer. The questions are really just meant to prompt conversation. They're not meant to feel like you're defending your thesis. They are just there as a jumping off point, really.
So what were some of the questions? Like what for you is the question that you really wish you had someone here, not me who has not read this book, but someone who's read the book to talk about?
Well, one of the thorny issues in the book for me had to do with the grandmother who raised the sisters. She's a really complicated person. She did her best by these young girls when they came into her care. You have a sense that she wanted to give them a certain kind of life that she really wasn't able to give them. And she was very withholding. It was as if she didn't really know how to love them the way they deserved to be loved. And you see the effects of that withholding in their adult life. I would love to talk to somebody who has read this book also about whether or not she is a good character or a bad character. And of course, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, as it always is. She's a person who did her best with the tools she was given, and she didn't have that many tools.
And then later on this month, you'll also be posing some questions directly to the author, to Liz Moore, on Instagram. What's the question you're dying to ask her?
I would love to know about the research she did before she wrote this book, because it's evident that she really steeped herself in this community in a way that jumps off the page. I would love to know about that. I would love to know about how she got in the head of Mickey, who is a cop who I am assuming had a very different upbringing than Liz Moore. I'm not 100% sure of that. But I would just love to hear about how the story unfurled in her mind and how she followed it from beginning to end.
All right. I'm assuming we're going to have piqued some of our listeners' interest in this novel, assuming they go ahead and they read Long Bright River by Liz Moore. How can they ask questions of you, perhaps give you questions to ask the author? What's the way for them to participate in this?
I hope they will come to the New York Times Books Instagram account and look for the post that we put up yesterday that has a very bright yellow background and a picture of the cover of this book. You can't miss it. And leave questions there. And I'm hoping to have, a really robust conversation among readers of the book and create a sense of community around group text. even if you don't have a book group of your own wherever you live, we would like to help you feel like you belong to one through the New York Times.
So the Instagram is NYT Books.
Yes.
That's on Instagram. That's where they can find it.
Yes.
And if they have questions and want to use an old-timey form of technology like email, they can send an email to books@nytimes.com, and I will pass it along to you.
And I will really answer because I am really, really excited about this book and eager to converse about it.
Okay, so group text, first choice, Long Bright River by Liz Moore. If people's interests are not yet piqued, give us one last sort of pitch. Why this book? What drew you to it? Why do you think others should pick it up as well?
It's impossible to put down. It makes you think. It makes you look at your family and feel grateful for them. It makes you ask. Hopefully, not necessarily. It makes you think about where you fit into your family and how you relate to your own siblings if you have them. It makes you ask questions about where we are right now in this country in terms of addiction and how we treat addicts or don't treat addicts. It makes you think about how committed you are to your job. Mickey gives up an awful lot for hers. And it made me also want to go to Philadelphia and have a cheesesteak.
Well, hopefully that'll pique people's interests in not just the cheesesteak, but also the novel. The book, again, is called Long Bright River by Liz Moore. Elisabeth Egan is an editor at the Book Review and the columnist for this new feature called Group Text. Liz, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Tina Jordan, John Williams, and Greg Coles. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
All right. It's a new year. I'm assuming that many of you have done some reading over the holidays. I have done some reading over the holidays, and I'm going to eke them out slowly. So I'm confessing what I've done already up front. Tina, let's start with you because you have a really beautiful book in front of you that's just out in paper. And I remember when the hardcover came out last year, it was just this incredible object.
It's an incredible object in paperback, too. It's called Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts, 12 Journeys into the Medieval World. And it's by somebody named Christopher Day, and I'm going to butcher his last name, Hamel, Hamel. And what it is a look at 12 medieval manuscripts, which exist in various archives and libraries around the world. There are a lot of medieval manuscripts that exist. This surprised me. But what he does is take you as a reader through each one of these 12 manuscripts, how they were created, what their history is. He's explaining the iconography in each one, looking at the paper, the skins, the ink, the fittings, the bindings, the pigments, and everything is illustrated. So you're seeing these details. It's almost like sitting in the rare, book room of a library and having this thing on your lap. And the remarkable thing, of course, is that these manuscripts are all so frail that they're the kind of things that you and me would never be allowed to see. We can go see great works of art, we can see sculpture, we can see paintings, but we would never, ever be allowed into a museum or library and allowed to look at these. And so not only are you able to look at them, the fact that he's explaining the tiniest details about each one of them is fascinating. The very first chapter is about the Gospel Book of St. Augustine, which is late 6th century, I believe he says. And he takes you through everything. I mean, basically lays out why some people think this really was St. Augustine's book, why some people don't. He basically makes the case. And he's showing you a manuscript that was created basically as like the Christian literary tradition was, emerging from the rubbles of the Roman Empire.
Are most of these religious books?
Most of them, but not all, yes.
Tina, I have to say I'm a little bit appalled because I'm looking at that book in front of you and you have dog-eared that book, which is a beautiful book.
I know. I'm a bad person.
Do you do that all the time? Are you a dog-earer?
I'm a dog-earer.
I'm a dog-earer. Oh, yeah.
I'm a dog-earer.
I'm not sure I would dog-ear that, but that is a very different kind of looking book. I might not do it in that one.
Okay.
Oh,
so
great. Thanks, John.
Please leave, Tina.
I hope you feel bad, but continue.
I feel properly.
You've dog-eared multiple pages.
I've dog-eared multiple pages. I know. I really am a bad person.
I'm curious, Tina. You recently read the Honor That Held Them, the novel by Sylvia Townsend Warner,
Yes.
which is also set in medieval times. Is that the book that led you to this one? Or
It is actually.
Yeah.
I loved that so much. And I saw this on our reject shelf. Nobody wanted it, so I snatched it and took it home over the holidays.
I imagine it's beautifully illustrated.
It's beautifully illustrated. Like I said, there are close-ups of a lot of the drawings and iconography and explanations of the inks used and the paints used and the gilding used. And there's a stain on the page here because it must have been a brass fitting. It's such an immediate feeling reading it. I'm about halfway through at this point, and I have to say I just love it. Sorry, I wanted to read to you about goat skin, but I think I maybe didn't dog-ear the right page. Oh, no, wait. Let me read it to you. Okay, so, for example, in the Gospel of St. Augustine, he's taking us into the room where the manuscript has been laid on the table for him, and he says, curiously, the pages of the manuscript curled towards the darker, former hair side of the skin, precisely the opposite of the natural curve of the skin when it was around the animal. That, I'm told by conservators, is because the fibers on the outer surface of any pelt are denser and less flexible, whereas those on the soft, pliable flesh side expand rapidly as they take in moisture. I mean, I know that sounds gross. I just love details
Gross
like that.
but informative.
It's gross but informative. John, what are you reading?
It's a new year, but I'm calling back a little bit to 2019 when I read a book fairly recently by George Gissing called New Grub Street. I'm reading another novel by Gissing now called The Odd Women, which is fantastic. I'm highly recommending it. I'm about halfway through.
I think you tweeted about this book with relation to Vivian Gornick.
Yes. Well, the reason I'm reading it and the reason I read New Grub Street is because she has an essay about Gissing in her book The Men in My Life, which is a very beautiful little volume that collects, I think, 6 of her essays about male writers, Philip Roth and other people. But it opens with an essay about Gissing, who was a late 19th century, early 20th century writer, British writer, and who is a favorite of Gornick's. And she actually, I think, titled her memoir The Odd Woman and the City because of this book, The Odd Women, which she said after she discovered it, she read every 6 months for years. Recently we were talking about people who reread things and whether they're lying or not. I trust Gornick. I think I don't know why she would brag about that, but I think she's obsessed with this book, and I understand why. It was published a few years after, I think it was 1893, a few years after Henry James's The Bostonians was published. It's actually a book that has a lot in common with that. I think James was a bit more satirical in his novel, but it is about a sort of triangle or slightly more than a triangle of people who are dealing with essentially what at that time was the foremost vanguard of the feminist movement. And there are 2 women in it who teach women to work at trades that have more of a future in them than just the more traditional things they've been allowed to do. And one of them thinks that it's fine if in addition to that the women want to have romance or get married. One of them, who's 30 years old, younger than the other, is just very strict and thinks that women should just be absolutely opposed to marriage entirely. And I just want to read one thing that character, Rhoda Nunn, says at one point to this other woman, Miss Barfoot. So Miss Barfoot has basically shown some softness towards someone who has strayed off the path of their theory. And Rhoda says, all her spare time was given to novel reading. If every novelist could be strangled and thrown into the sea, we should have some chance of reforming women. The girl's nature was corrupted with sentimentality, like that of all but every woman who is intelligent enough to read what is called the best fiction, but not intelligent enough to understand its vice. Love, 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 a sickening sameness of vulgarity. What is more vulgar than the ideal of novelists? And she goes on to say, in real life, how many men and women fall in love? Not one in every 10,000, I am convinced. Not one married pair in 10,000 have felt for each other as 2 or 3 couples do in every novel. And so she then says that charity for human weakness is all very well in its place, but it is precisely one of the virtues that you must not teach. You have to set an example of the sterner qualities to discourage anything that resembles sentimentalism. And so they fight. And then, of course, this sort of charming guy enters the picture, and he's convinced that he can overcome Rhoda's opposition to marriage and convince her to fall in love with him. And so there's a lot of good psychology. Elaine Showalter, the scholar and author, writes the introduction and says that it's astonishingly contemporary in terms of what it thinks about gender and sex and marriage, but it's also just on some level a great sort of dialogue-driven story about romance and people's motivations. Greg, what are you reading? You're making progress.
I'm making progress. It's a new year, and I'm not reading a new book. I'm The last time I was on the podcast, I had just started Robin Kelley's biography of Thelonious Monk, which is called Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original. Now I'm almost done with it. I've got under 100 pages left. It's an interesting book because Robin Kelley is an amazing researcher, but not much of a storyteller. And so what he does is he just lays all of the stuff that he's compiled out on the page and in very granular detail, and you just kind of work your way through it. And it's almost as if you are living the life as it was experienced, and it's up to you as the reader to impose shape on it. Some biographers say, here's what was formative. It's all anecdote, and you get a big picture sense of things. This is a very small picture sense of things, and like the person living the life, it's up to you to say what it all means.
Sounds Knausgaardian.
It is a little bit. What's interesting about that experience is that Thelonious Monk, in the popular imagination, the caricature of him is that he was very childlike, eccentric, mentally ill, an addict, and kind of the savant of music. And this book sets out to disabuse you of that notion and instead reinforces it. Because all those things are true, but by giving you such depth and layering, it complicates the picture of it. Thelonious Monk was very well learned in music. He was classically trained. He was a true genius in music. The childlike, eccentric part of him, it was a little bit like Glenn Gould, kind of singing or dancing while he's playing. There's some Robert Lowell, the manic breakdowns. But the childlike thing was like a purity that you come to realize through reading the book is hugely dependent on his wife, Nellie Monk, who just carved out this space for him to focus everything on his music. And he focused obsessively on the music where, I mean, far from just being a genius, he was a genius, but it wasn't like it just came to him. He worked super hard at it and thought all the time about who he was playing with and how best to convey his image of the music to the rest of the band. There's a lot in here about personnel changes, and it's funny, for a string of about 100 pages, you just get one bass player after the next after the next, because he can't find a bass player who works well to fulfill his vision for the music. And so it's like the drummers in Spinal Tap.
I was about to say the bass players aren't exploding, I hope.
No. But because Kelley just gives you all these names. I mean, I haven't heard of most of the bass players that Monk tried out for his quartet and didn't work out. But you get them, and you get kind of what their background was, and then you move on to the next one. And so yeah, I won't remember any of them. I don't remember any of them already. But along the way, you also get kind of the amazing legends of jazz that he played with as part of his quartet. He played with Sonny Rollins. He played with Max Roach. He was good friends with Bud Powell. There's a nice moment that I just read where he and Bud Powell are hanging out in Ornette Coleman's flat in Greenwich Village, and you just get this sense of this vibrant scene that was going on. You know, Thelonious Monk's time is kind of the mid-40s to – he died in the early 80s, but his time in the spotlight was really kind of over by the early 70s. Jazz was already – being supplanted as a big popular music form by probably the mid-'60s. And so you have about 20 years where Thelonious Monk is kind of at the center of it all. But his wife, Nellie, and her contributions to his career and his life and taking care of him through his mania, through making all of the tour arrangements and the contracts and everything, she comes across as a real Vera Nabokov type, recognizing his genius and making the room for him to focus just on that.
See, I'm glad we have Monk's music, but Rhoda Nunn in my novel would not approve of Nellie's using her life just to uplift,
to prop
the
up
man's art.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you get a bit melancholic reading about these art scenes of yore that it feels like no longer exist in any kind of real space, but maybe it's just on
it's
Twitter?
Funny, I'm a big poetry reader, and it's impossible to read a jazz biography without thinking about poetry because it's got that same – I mean, I mentioned Robert Lowell, who also – I think Robert Lowell was on the cover of Time magazine at one point. So was Thelonious Monk. And these are arts and scenes that at one point were at the center of the American cultural imagination and have become marginalized or kind of specialty interests.
I guess I was thinking about it on a more granular level of like the flat in Greenwich Village where these people are hanging out together. Because one of the books that I read, which I'll talk about in a later episode, was the oral history of Mike Nichols. And you just get the sense of like, those were the parties. Like, those parties are not happening anymore with those kind of people. So just that feeling of like that bygone era where people
I think those parties are happening. We're not at them.
We're just not invited. That's what you're saying.
I don't think they're as fun or as chatty as they used to be.
That's the way I think.
Yeah, that's my grumpy old man version of it.
That's my grumpy old woman.
What are you reading, Pamela?
John, before I talk about what I read, I want to acknowledge a mistake I made on one of the episodes back in December. Whittier College, which I discussed back when I was talking about John Farrell's biography of Richard Nixon, was not, in fact, a community college. It was a small liberal arts college. It always has been, and it was founded in 1887. So thank you, Bob Timmerman, for writing and correcting me on that. Okay. As I confessed, I'm going to go back through my vacation reading. I left reading a book that I talked about briefly on the last episode, which was The Chestnut Man by Søren Sveistrup, a Nordic noir kind of thriller book that I read because it's exactly what you want to be reading on the plane, and I did finish it on the plane. It is really well done. The author, it's his first novel, but he is the creator of the Danish TV show The Killing, which was then reimagined as an American TV show. And I've seen neither, although I now would like to. I love Scandinavian noir because part of me wishes I lived in Scandinavia, so I need to know the bad stuff that goes on there to kind of temper that longing on my part. So
not all Hoyga.
Right. It's not all Hoyga and, just superior people in the happiness department. This book is about a serial killer who is chopping parts of his victims off to resemble chestnut men, which are these little dolls that kids in Scandinavia, I guess, make out of chestnuts. And what differentiates it from run-of-the-mill thrillers is that I think the characters are really strongly drawn and interesting. The two cops that are chasing after the chestnut man, one of them is a single mother named Naya Thulin, and she is a kind of up-and-coming person in the department who really wants to move into high-tech crime. That Murder Squad is kind of no longer where the action is at, and you want to be in sort of the cyber unit. And she's paired with this man named Mark Haas, who has been kicked out of Europol for reasons that are unclear and has kind of been sent back to the backwaters of Copenhagen to work on the Murder Squad, where he doesn't want to be. And Naya certainly doesn't want to be with him. And so it's a little bit about them. There's also a character in the book who I thought of as a kind of version of the prime minister character in the TV show Borgen, which I loved. And this is a woman named Rosa Hartung, and her daughter has been missing for over a year when the novel begins. It's written in the way that a lot of books, I think, by TV people are written, which is that very, very short, action-packed, episodic chapters. So while the book itself is over 500 pages, it definitely moves very quickly. It's exactly the kind of book that you don't want to be reading while holding down a full-time job because, you need to evacuate everything out of your life. So it's perfect airplane reading. And I really liked it. I'm really curious to see what he does next book-wise. I hope that he doesn't just go back to TV. You read it too, Tina, didn't you?
I did.
What did you think?
I loved it. And I agree with you that it's incredibly cinematic. And that does make a book like this even more propulsive.
I have to say the idea of a serial killer named after these little nut dolls that children make is just a little bit hygge.
A little bit, maybe. I don't think you're practicing hygge as a drug, probably. All right, let's run down the books again. Tina?
So I read Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts by Christopher de Hamel.
I'm reading The Odd Women by George Gissing, and I'll also throw in a recommendation of The Men in My Life by Vivian Gornick.
I'm reading Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original by Robin D.G. Kelly.
And I read The Chestnut Man by Søren Sveistrup. All right, thanks so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.